Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Psych Scene webinar on Waves of Reform, Conversations with Dr. Astha Tomar. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. You might have noticed a slight change in the logo. My name is Sanil Rege, consultant psychiatrist. This is the first webinar with the Academy by Psych Scene, and what we aim to do, check it out at academy.psychscene.com, where we have a range of webinars and accredited courses as well. So if you haven't checked it out, do visit the website. To today's webinar, I'm sure you're all interested and excited to hear from Astha, Dr. Tomar. So our webinar topic today is Conversations with Dr. Astha Tomar, Waves of Reform. We'll be talking about the Productivity Commission, Royal Commission, Medicare, and what it all means for psychiatrists. Introducing Dr. Tomar. Dr. Tomar has been a private psychiatrist at the Melbourne Clinic for almost 15 years now. She's the chairwoman of the Victorian Branch of RANZCP and the head of Youth Mental Health Services at Peninsula Health. She has led the Victorian Branch response to the RC, the Royal Commission, and the related reform processes, including the new Mental Health and Wellbeing Act and the Productivity Commission report on mental health. She was on the Better Access Evaluation Clinical Advisory Group 2022, which evaluated the community's access to psychiatrists, psychologists, and GPs through the MBS Initiative, the Department of Health, Australian Government. And Astha also holds a number of positions on multiple expert advisory groups, including the Mental Health Ministerial Advisory Group, established to provide strategic guidance to the Victorian Government on mental health system transformation, expert Advisory Committee on Potential Misuse of Drugs of Dependence, member of SafeScript Expert Advisory Group as well. So I guess with that introduction, there's of course a lot more, many of you know Astha personally as well, I'm sure. So that gives you the opportunity to, of course, use the chat section. So don't forget to put down any comments that you have or questions. And of course, we might not be able to get to all of the questions, but we'll try to incorporate as much as possible. So with that in mind, let's get started. Welcome, Astha. Thanks for being with us today. We're just going to check audio. All good. You can hear me. And do you want to say something so that we can make sure we can hear you as well?
Sounds good. The only thing I would like to say is your name sort of says George on your screen, and I'm pretty sure you're not George, you're Sanil.
Yeah. Does it say George? No, Sanil Rege. Yeah. All right.
Yes.
So let's kick off. Of course, let's dive straight into it. Seeing that the topic is waves of reform in mental health, could you first give us a sort of an overview of how does it all work at the broader system level? There are so many players, as we know, in the sector that often it becomes really confusing for clinicians, for patients, carers alike, and the support system essentially. So can you give us an overview of what that looks like?
Okay. Thank you, Sanil. First up, thank you and Psych Scene Hub for inviting me here today. And I think it's a bit of a milestone for the work we have been doing at the Victorian Branch, seeing that this is the week of second anniversary of the release of the final report of the Royal Commission into Victoria mental health system. But before we start, I do want to acknowledge the lands we stand on. I do want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Nations and the traditional custodians of the lands and waters known as Australia. We honor and respect the elders past and present and emerging, and we recognize those with lived and living experience of a mental health condition, including community members and college members. So coming to your question, I think it's important to remember that mental illness contributes to the third highest group of diseases after cancer and cardiovascular diseases, and is responsible for an estimated 12% of the total disease impact in Australia. And that makes it everybody's business. The way the Australian health system is set up, and the funding involved, it involves both Commonwealth as well as state and territory governments. Simply, the Commonwealth Government is responsible for the MBS subsidized mental health services, which are provided by general practitioners, GPs, psychiatrists, and the allied health professionals. The Veterans Mental Health Services through the DVA, the Primary Care Services through GP. And PBS also provides subsidized prescription drugs. And then we also have NDIS. The state and territory governments, they set the legislative, regulatory, policy frameworks for the mental health service delivery in their jurisdiction. They fund, they deliver the public sector mental health services. Now we have to remember, it's the public mental health services which provide specialist care for people with severe mental illnesses. And that is the care which is delivered in the public acute and psychiatric hospital settings, specialized community mental health care services, and also in the residential mental health care services. Now we cannot forget the NGOs like Beyond Blue, Headspace, Lifeline, Black Dog Institute. The NGOs are the key providers of psychosocial support services, advocacy, telephone and internet-based interventions. These services focus on providing the well-being support, assistance for those living with mental illnesses, and we have to remember they do not provide the assessment and the treatment work, which is undertaken by the clinical services, which are funded by the public health system, that is the state level. And a large part of population with mental illnesses over the years has been increasingly relying on private mental health providers. That includes private psychiatric hospitals, private psychiatrists, GPs, and private allied health professionals like psychologists. So the treatment costs there are generally covered by the private health insurance funds and the co-payment by the individual and MBS contributions. So I hope that sort of gives a bit of an idea on the landscape of the mental health services or the system in Australia. Thanks, Sanil.
Yeah, that's quite a succinct sort of overview, and welcome to a lot of new sort of people who've joined in. So welcome all of you. A reminder, please do use the chat section if you've got any questions as we go through as well. Our topic today is about reform, and the word reform is often used, in media. It is really a big buzzword. And when we think about reform in mental health in Australia, is this something that is it something new completely that we're all sort of waking up to, or is this something that's been done before? And if we compare Australia to international standards, where do we stand? So in two parts. Firstly, is reform something new? And two, how are we doing related to other countries?
Well, we are today talking about waves of reform, and in Australia, mental health reform does have a long history. I think it formally started roughly around 30 years ago at the time of deinstitutionalization, when the old psychiatric institutions were being shut, with the philosophy of mainstreaming mental health. We could think of that as an effort with three major prongs: mainstreaming of mental illnesses into general health, mainstreaming of people struggling with mental illnesses back into the community, and ensuring they have an access to high quality care. And I think overall, there was also a purpose of destigmatizing mental illnesses. We had our first national mental health strategy, first policy with a plan around this. It was around the same time, with Australia as one of the first countries in the world to have a national mental health strategy. Now, since then, since I think 1993, we have had 6 5-year national mental health plans. In addition to these strategic plans, we have also had 30 years of evidence from official inquiries into mental health. 32 of those inquiries were between 2006 and 2012 alone. And when we compare ourselves to the international stage, where we have to remember it's WHO and OECD who have placed high priority on mental health. Australia is recognized by OECD as a global leader in mental health, and OECD approaches mental health, we have to remember, through the lens of economics and development. The WHO, their efforts have been towards mental health has been mainly around promotion of mental health and well-being, prevention of mental illness, protection of human rights, but most crucially, it is really important to provide healthcare for those affected by mental illness. So yes, Australia in a way is a leader on the mental health, on the world stage in the mental health space.
So, yeah, I think there's a huge focus now in Australia on mental health. I recognize the funding as well. There's a huge amount of funding, particularly when one looks at the news in the UK and the NHS and what's happening there. I think we're in a reasonably good position. I guess the aim is to ensure that we learn from those lessons and don't sort of go down a path that the NHS has gone down.
True.
So one of the key topics for today was, of course, about the Royal Commission, the Productivity Commission, and myself as well. I often get confused between the two. What are the aims, etc. So let's start with the Productivity Commission into mental health. Myself, as I said, I'm kind of removed from often the politics of it, being a private psychiatrist and educator. And of course, when I first heard of it, when the report came out, can you tell us a little bit about the Productivity Commission, what it is, and how it influences us as psychiatrists?
Thanks, Sanil. You're right. Productivity Commission into mental health did generate a lot of hope Australia-wide. I think it was in November of 2020 that Productivity Commission had released its report, and it was intended to be a guide to reforming the Australia's mental health system. It found that Australia's current mental health system is not comprehensive, that reform of the mental health system is much needed. But I think most importantly, I suppose, the first two findings are something which are commonly known. But I think what they did was it did give us some hard numbers, which are very difficult to ignore. It found that mental ill health and suicide are costing the Australian economy around $200 to $220 billion a year. And it suggested that with its recommended changes, if a government would implement their recommended changes, it would save the government as much as $20 billion a year by an investment of just around $4.2 billion a year. Now, that's not a bad return on your money. But in addition to the money, it showed that such an investment could produce large benefits in quality of life for people with mental ill health. And that was valued at up to $18 billion annually. Now, the Commission's recommendations, they extended beyond just the health system, the mental health system, and it did go into schools, workplaces, and the housing and justice sectors. It worked over 2 years, and it made around 120 findings and recommendations, and they sort of covered around 5 major areas. 1, prevention and early intervention, including suicide prevention. The health sector improving people's access to mental health care. Services people need beyond the health system, like housing, legal support. And it also elevated the importance of psychological health and safety in workplaces. But I think most importantly, it emphasized accountability and strengthening the evaluation culture. To its credit, the Australian government did welcome the report. And in the 2021-22 federal budget, it allocated around $2.3 billion over 4 years to the National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Plan. So the investment made by the Australian government didn't really parallel the investment needed or suggested by the Productivity Commission, even at the start of the implementation of that report, let alone in the future. So it has the ambition it generated, or the hope it generated, and the financial commitment which was made to that report, that didn't really parallel.
Those are some pretty big numbers. And of course, we have the Royal Commission as well, which, into Victorian mental health system. How do those two things, because we've got a national strategic sort of mental health plan. The Productivity Commission obviously looked at this federal budget, 2.3 billion that you mentioned over 4 years. And then we've got the Royal Commission into Victorian mental health system, released probably around the same time. And I guess everyone in Victoria has heard of it. What's the difference? How do they link to each other? Could you give us an idea about that?
Sure. So it was around the same time. We have to remember the commitment to have Royal Commission into Victorian mental health system was announced in November 2018 by Premier Dan Andrews, and the Royal Commission released its final report in March of 2021. And the reform agenda was to redesign the Victoria's mental health and wellbeing system. The Royal Commission determined that the present system is not designed to support the needs of people living with mental illnesses or psychological distress. To its credit, the Victorian government accepted all recommendations from the report, all 74 of them, and has commenced this implementation and has allocated over $6 billion commitment to mental health reform. Now that's massive by any standard, like let alone Australia-wide, other states, worldwide. That is a major commitment to be made. So I think the Royal Commission and Victoria's mental health system definitely is a once in a lifetime opportunity. A massive effort went into preparing the report. And I think sometimes, if you have time at some point, do read the witness statements of the psychiatrists, which drives the point home of how broken the system has been for years and how psychiatrists have consistently highlighted around how desperate the situation was. And I think it's important to highlight that because every once in a while we do hear the criticism that psychiatrists as the leaders in the system were not critical of how bad the system was. So do read it when you get a chance. And I think the ones I really liked were by Dr. Simon Stafraci, Dr. Ruth Wine, as well as by Dr. Neil Coventry, and many, many others, which gives you a gist of how much the mental health system had been struggling. And I have to say, it continues to struggle. And I think it's also important to remember why that report, that particular report, has generated so much of hope in the system. I think in addition to that financial and political commitment, along with the 10-year reform plan, I think the all recommendations emphasized being not just inclusive of lived experience, but having them lead this, of which the college has been quite supportive. Now, we do want to ensure the voice of all lived experiences captured in it, including the ones who struggle with severe spectrum of mental illnesses, which sometimes risks getting lost in all those, and sometimes those are loud and sometimes they are somewhat angry voices. And I think I do want to mention, I was sorry, I'll just read out this one where I think one has to remember that the federal government takes responsibility from primary care, while the state and territory governments manage acute and hospital mental health care. What was different about the Royal Commission in Victoria was that the Commission recommended and the government accepted that the state-based reform work will capture primary as well as secondary as well as tertiary level of care. When you have to remember, state is largely responsible for the health services-based care. That is the tertiary level specialist clinical care. And that makes it indeed ambitious because over the last many years, the state-funded public health system has barely managed to provide care to the top 1% of people in the state, the ones with severe mental illnesses, who are actually 3% of the total population. And now the commitment has been made to provide mental health and well-being support for the whole of the population, a roughly 20 to 25% of the population struggling with any mental illness and at-risk population. So that makes it a really ambitious and I would have to say a very expensive exercise. Yes, so quite hope generating, but also I hate to use the word concerning here, but yeah, so just that little confusion around between the federal and the state government, whose responsibility lies where, and are we risking adding chaos to that division of responsibility? Thanks, Sanil. I hope that answered it.
Yeah. So our audience as well, please do add your thoughts, any comments in the chat section. I'm hoping that all of you do have that access to the chat section, because normally there are a few comments, but hopefully there will be more as we go on. So you did mention the college. So I understand you're very involved, at that systemic level. As psychiatrists, working consultant psychiatrists, either private, public, we have many who've joined us working, say, in private, in public. And we might not be as sort of aware of what's happening at the systemic level, where we're all part of the college. And I'm wondering, when we think about the Productivity Commission, the Royal Commission, and where the college sits, so what are your thoughts about, the college's input, the college's role in all of this, especially seeing that you've been the chair of the Victorian Branch through this time? Can you tell us, what that's been like? What are the sort of ups and downs, if at all, and your experience overall?
Thanks, Sanil. First up, just a disclaimer that my discussion today is not in my official capacity as the chair of the Victorian Branch, but more in my experience in that reform work. So this is not an official platform of the college. So I have to put that disclaimer there. I think just like the funding in the health system, the state branch's role is primarily policy and advocacy at the state levels. And all states in Australia, as well as New Zealand as a nation, I think we have to remember they have all had an inquiry of sorts in the recent times. For Victorian state, it was high stake, as it did generate a lot of hope from the vision of the reform and a really good opportunity to finally get it right. The reform process was, and as is still is, an opportunity to participate in the reform with major dollar commitment. And it also became an opportunity to highlight the role college can play and is keen to play in that work. And I think we had a really good start. It was a really good start with the recommendations from the interim report, which Victorian Branch had advocated for, that all JMOs, and now it has sort of changed it to almost 70% of the JMOs from 2023, they're now to have a mandatory psychiatry rotation. Now, this is intended to help with strengthening the future doctors' understanding and related practices of mental illnesses in their future practices. And it is also a bit of a recruitment strategy. Now, we have to remember again, this is a first in Australia and possibly in the world. So something to celebrate, as it does go a long way in destigmatizing mental health issues, which otherwise, even within the doctors, sometimes has an air of it's too complex, it's too vague, and it's too hard. But then, this initiative comes with a responsibility to ensure that these fresh doctors, new doctors, have an experience of a good functional health system, which endeavors to and delivers good quality clinical care. There's no point having them experience a system that doesn't work, because if that happens, that will surely turn them off the mental health for a long time, and that is not something which we want. Now, Mental Health Wellbeing Division, which has been given the responsibility of transforming Victoria's mental health wellbeing new system, has largely focused their work around building the frameworks, the governance structures, and ensuring that the lived experience, including the carers as well as the consumers, were at the front and the center of it. And I would say that the division has been quite committed to it. Now, we at Victorian Branch, we've had some really good opportunities, and I think the main one was Mental Health Wellbeing Bill, which will be an act in 2023 and has significant implications for clinical practices. This was a big project. It started off quite wobbly, I have to be honest, because the initial draft was a little chaotic. And we gave it support, we gave some specific feedbacks, including that not to rush through changing criteria of the assessment and compulsory treatment parts of the Act. Now, this was taken on board by the division as well as the Minister of Mental Health, which then established the independent review panel to look into it. And if you know, I mean, you must have heard that Professor Richard Newton has been invited to be a part of an esteemed panel, which has both carer and consumer representation and is led by Justice Marshall, who himself has had a lived experience of a mental illness. And that panel is currently working on these parts. We were also quite clear with some of the other concerns we had with the bill, and we made both the division and the Minister of Mental Health fully aware of it. Now, the announcement of a new funding of $4.5 million for psychiatrists for the future has been a major one. Again, something unheard of in any other states or federal level, and thus it was a very welcome news. This included up to 200 new training positions and funding to strengthen the system structures, like with better funding positions of directors of training, advanced training, SIMG DOTs, rural regional DOT, again, one of its first kind. But yes, what we seem to continue to struggle with is a continuing to crumble mental health system. And that is at the pointy end of delivery of care to who needs it and when they need it. The unmet growing demand for specialist clinical treatment care and support, that bit is still missing. That part of the system remains stressed. Now, in this part of work, we also felt, it was quite closely felt, and we also chose to acknowledge the anger felt in the sector, which we all know was largely related to the unmet clinical needs for years in the Victorian mental health system. So for us, what became important was to highlight that if within the same hospital, we are confident that needs of someone, let's say with appendicitis or a cardiac event or a suspected tumor will be met. But we are not so sure of the safety and quality of care they will receive if they struggle with a psychotic episode or a manic or a depressive episode. And with chronicity of those events, then we have to say it is unacceptable. And yes, it is discriminatory. And yes, it is breach of basic human rights. And yes, it becomes the job of us as psychiatrists and College of Psychiatrists to highlight that. And sometimes repeatedly say it, because sometimes that is what is needed. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think particularly the whole COVID period, I think when, the Royal Commission was commissioned, I guess, COVID wasn't probably factored in. We know the last 2 to 3 years has been a really difficult period across, starting from, I guess, consumer level, carer level, all the way up, and it continues to be felt. And you mentioned trainees. I think trainees often bear, a lot of brunt of this. And if there are any trainees who have joined us as well, just to let you know that probably the majority of what Astha said is very, very valuable for your critical essay exams, because these are the sort of topics that come up, but there's some real gems in there that you can utilize for the essay exams as well. So obviously a lot of work that you've been involved in. Looking back, what do you think has sort of helped or worked in your opinion?
Thanks, Sanil. I mean, because you mentioned COVID, I do want to say, because this did come up in one of the discussions I was having actually with Professor Richard Newton. I think when the Royal Commission report was released around the same time COVID had hit us, and I know the commitment has been around implementing all the recommendations. But I think we have to remember that the world has changed since then. The world we live in is different. The world, and you would think those recommendations would surely have been affected by and changed by those changing needs, changing environments, and it will be extremely problematic if we continue to implement those recommendations as a separate piece of work. Because we have yet to get a feel of that glue which pulls it all together. And I think it's really important that we have to look at the big picture, that it's not about implementation of the recommendations, but to reform and set up a system which meets the needs. So just a point I wanted to sort of say, because COVID has changed our world. And I think with COVID, the impact on the workforce is something which can't be, we can't really ignore that. Now, coming back to what worked, well, it was a lot of work. I mean, that's the word, a lot of work. It summarizes it well. And I think it's important to remember that such a work, it needs a village to do that work. It is on massive scale. And we as psychiatrists have our day-to-day jobs as well. And this does ask for a lot of commitment as an add-on pro bono work. So for us at the Victorian Branch, engagement became the key to the crucial work. So it was engagement with the policymakers, bureaucrats, Department of Health, Mental Health Wellbeing Division, Minister of Mental Health. In addition to that, it was also building relationships with external stakeholders, including carers, consumers, the organizations representing the lived experience, both Tandem as well as WMIAC, and also the other organizations like ANMF, HACSU, Ambulance Victoria, Mental Health Victoria, and AMA. But most importantly, I think it was engagement with our own membership. We made sure that there were regular updates, information sharing, we kept the members into the loop, and we also ensured their participation by surveys, emails, workshops, big and small group meetings, and tapping into the expertise of esteemed psychiatrists. I have to acknowledge the dedication and passion of quite a few of my colleagues who, whatever time of the day, they were always available to hear our concerns, give advice and support, and that was invaluable. I think media engagement was a big part of it. And again, I think and maybe it's the change of times, but it did become an important part of how we approach things at the college, and somewhat different to how things have been done in the past. But now we all know Twitter, LinkedIn, media releases have become a big part of how we engage with the community out there. I think we tried to do it slightly differently, where it was not about keeping it within the college. It was an attempt to be with people out there, with the community out there, sharing our perspectives, knowing that, you know, we might not always agree, but it was really important to put it out there so that could help us find some commonalities in those perspectives. We were available to media outlets for comments on articles being written from the community's perspectives, but then we also had to be careful around, I think the only word is not playing with fire. Just we had to be careful around, you know, what we had put out there was quite in sync with, you know, how we were working with the reform work. Just a interesting anecdote. We had put an opinion piece in Herald Sun around December, just around Christmas last year. It was quite well received. Originally, we had titled it "A Continuing to Crumble Victorian Mental Health System," but it was unilaterally changed by their editors to "Damn, we must get this right," and that was a little, a little embarrassing, but you know, that's how it happens. Staying on the goal was crucial for us. It was critical for us that it was advocacy for the needs out there, the unmet needs, which have been there for years, for people struggling with severe mental illnesses. At times, it was also important to help people recognize that we are not a union. There was a difference between a union and us as an organization which focuses on education, training, and practice of psychiatry. And thus we had to ensure we didn't indulge ourselves in turf wars and making sure that we came from community's perspective of health needs of people with severe mental illnesses and possibly extending to moderate mental illnesses, but they have to be met with timely access to safe, effective, evidence-based care and treatment. And thus there was a little bit of an attempt towards a voice of reason, which at times became the only voice which was being somewhat critical, but I think it was really important for us to be honest, and that had to be said and done too. Very quickly, support from the college was a cornerstone in this work. Traditionally, college's focus has been federal level and binational work, and the potential of work at the state level has not been fully utilized, which has always surprised the state branches, because if you remember, 50% of the mental health funding in any area comes from the state government. So it's the public health services where most of the training and the clinical services happen. So engagement with the membership also happens at the local branch. That gives people a sense of belonging and connection, but we'll leave it as a story for another day. But with all the inquiries, commissions, commitments in mental health at state or national level, be it New Zealand, Tasmania, Western Australia, Victoria and Queensland now, and I think with upcoming state elections in New South Wales, where Chair Dr. Angelo Vagano is working tremendously hard for bringing mental health on the election agenda. And I sincerely hope our college has recognized how important it is to recognize that work, support, and resource the work which needs to be done at the state level. I do want to quickly acknowledge the hard work. You know, I had a great policy and advocacy team who came into the role, and I think they also had sort of very limited experience in mental health, policy advocacy in mental health space. And it was around the same time as I had stepped into the position, and we had to hit the ground running. We had to respond to some very tight timelines, some very complex work, and it was nonstop. But I think we stayed focused on finding commonalities in different perspectives, working together as psychiatrists, clinicians, consumers, carers. And I do want to mention the word patients here, because we do prefer to use different terms as a consumer, as a patient. And I think that has to be included too. And we as a college, we did do some proactive work in lived experience representation, and we do need to do it more within the college. We have to support our community collaboration committee, which is a part of the binational structure, to support our work. Thanks.
Interesting sort of landscape, definitely, that we're in. So I guess, you know, a lot of questions for us are with psychiatrists is, you know, where do we all fit into this? But before we sort of get there, particularly when you talked about so many waves of reform over several years. And, there's often the college has these essay questions as well. And one of them, one of the quotes I remember was, "Those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it." Talk about history repeating itself. So I guess for the skeptic, if I had to ask a skeptical question, seeing that we're talking about recent waves of Productivity Commission, Royal Commission, how does it tie up with things in the past? And although, it's connected to history, do we see sort of history repeat itself where recommendations are made and possibly not implemented? For a skeptic, me.
Good question. And I think it reminds me of a conversation I recently had with Professor Ruth Wine. And she reminded me that beyond the waves of reform from inquiries and commissions, we've also had waves of reform within the practice of psychiatry, how we practice psychiatry. Looking back, I think the wave of all those waves has been deinstitutionalization, which happened in the 80s. It was quite purposeful. It was quite open about aspirations of mainstreaming of mental health into healthcare, out of asylums into the overall health system, into community-based care. And I think it was, as I earlier said, quite an ambitious effort towards destigmatizing mental illnesses and ensuring appropriate care. Possibly, I think we are still in the throes of that big wave of deinstitutionalization, because I think the practices which were set up then are still, the system practices, or the system-wide, how the system operates is still the same which it was post that deinstitutionalization phase. And we do have to consider, if that's not working, obviously it's not working, but how do we sort of change that? And we do need to continue and achieve what the purpose of that deinstitutionalization phase was in the first place, which is of safe, good quality mental health care within the health system. Around the same time, we also had the start of broadening of available treatment options, both in biological and psychological therapies, an increased understanding of biological, psychological, social elements, both in causation as well as treatments for mental illnesses. We had better research. We had consistently improving evidence-based medicine. The third so-called wave could be, we could think of it as an improvement in access to care in the community through MBS. People being able to access psychiatric care with GPs and psychiatrists as specialists, along with setting up of, I think there was later set up the Better Access Initiative to provide psychotherapy options through psychologists. And also the private health system, which allowed people to have choices regarding their provider and the treatments they wished to try. It's important to mention that because as a private psychiatrists, our books are full, which means the need is out there. If the need is out there and people are relying on the private health system to meet those needs of a specialist care, there is something we do need to look at. So putting that aside, I think it's also important to recognize that we've also had the drive of human rights and responsibilities into mental health delivery of care. The concept that people with mental disabilities have the same human rights as everyone else is more accepted today than a few decades ago. Frequently in our work, we do see the competing priorities of different sets of rights, autonomy versus beneficence, for example. And all those need to be cautiously balanced in every instance, which we do in our day-to-day work. But the economic, social, and cultural rights of persons with mental disabilities must be protected and promoted. And as Professor Neeraj Gill, he said in one of his papers that the human rights movement does need to be integrated into mental health legislation, policy, and practice for a real mental health advocacy. Now, we have also had the growth and engagement of lived and living experience in the mental health sector, which has been long supported by the college. And I do think that this has led to a real impact in delivery of services, and Royal Commission consistently highlights the importance of lived experience at the front and center of the reform as well as delivery of health services. Now, at times, the survivor movement has consistently tried to be a part of this. I'll leave that aside too. We also have the technological and digital waves of reform with initiatives like telehealth, a lifeline for people in rural regional areas, which really showed its worth during COVID times. And hopefully it is here to stay, both in public as well as private health system. Even phone-based lifeline, etc. Now it's apps, online-based programs. One of the very successful ones have come out of Origin, a program called Most, a bit of a hybrid model, and has had some really good uptake and feedback. But the question, though, does remain. If the rationale behind all those waves was destigmatizing mental illnesses, greater alignment with physical health system, access to safe, effective, timely, evidence-based treatment, care, and support, why does it still feel like a dream? And I don't want to add to cynicism, but I recently had a chat with Professor Bruce Singh, who directed me to a paper by Dr. George Lipton. He is a past president of the college. The paper was titled Politics of Mental Health, Circles or Spirals. This was published in Australia New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry in 1983. And it talks about a recurrent theme in the care of the mentally ill is the alternation between having them cared for in large, dehumanizing institutional environments, or the other end of having them discharged into poor quality, dehumanizing community care. He talks about the alienation of severely mentally ill and how many developments for the emotionally disturbed, or the new term of psychologically distressed, at times it risks denying the needs of the most disturbed. And he also mentions that we mental health professionals, we delude ourselves that modern communication and education have made a major real impact on the attitudes of the population to the seriously mentally ill in their midst. So he talks about that stigma stays alive, the stigma towards the seriously mentally ill. And maybe I'll talk about that in a little while around the well-being bit, but maybe I will just sort of say here, I think sometimes the risk with the well-being initiatives, the prevention, the early intervention, which all has a real value in the mental health care, I think the risk around people still struggling with severe mental illnesses, despite the presence of that, is the risk of stigmatizing those illnesses again, or people who have those illnesses, is something which I think most of us are quite concerned around. But going back to the paper, Dr. Lipton did end the paper on a positive note. He hoped that in the 20th century, a real possibility exists that cycles of the past could become spirals of the future. He puts this hope on the combination of modern humanism, modern communication technology, and therapeutic advances, which he believed will provide a force leading to a much needed change.
Yeah, I think that's quite a sort of comprehensive answer, but at the same time raises a number of questions. And you said right at the start that Professor Ruth Vine talked about the waves of reform even within the practice of psychiatry. And Diane Grocott asks a very pertinent question related to that. She says, well done, Astha. Will you elaborate on how the college and the Victorian public mental health system plans to address the overwhelming number of adults who have realized that they have struggled with impairments from untreated ADHD, although many of them have been under the care of psychiatrists for their anxiety, depression, eating disorders, or trauma, or under addiction doctors with substance use disorder? I guess one can think about that waves of reform or reform in psychiatry from an illness perspective with the current wave of ADHD. So I guess I'm trying to link Diane's question with what you've said. Your thoughts on that? The college's role and the Victorian public mental health system's role?
I think it just goes back to access to care in the public health system. For example, any of the physical illnesses, people do have a choice between the public health system and the private health system, but it's still a choice in terms of they do have a guarantee that those needs will be met in the public health system. They can choose to go to the private health system to get an earlier response and possibly a different kind of quality of care. But as far as the standard of the safety and the standard of quality of care, which is expected in any part of the system, there is no confusion for a physical illness to have that in the public health system. But it's not the same in the mental health system. And that is quite concerning. And I think it just goes back to access to care in the public health system, increasing the capacity of delivery of care, and that sort of again goes back to whether we have infrastructure to deliver that care, whether we have workforce to deliver that care, because the workforce over the years has battled that moral distress. They have left public health system to go into the private health system. And I think it's in addition to that moral distress, it's the ability of that clinician to deliver the care which they have been trained and experienced in. And they do see that they will be able to deliver that care in the private health system and not public. But then it means the unmet need has been growing, and that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I guess the relevance of this is, of course, the training related to ADHD. As an educator, I guess I can say, and maybe a little bit of a plug as well, is that we are hosting the RANZCP endorsed and an RACGP accredited 3-evening webinar series on ADHD. So at March 28th, 29th, and 30th, for exactly this reason, because I think there is a huge gap overall in the training, and one can find themselves quite lost when it comes to these disorders. And I think besides that, of course, as part of the academy, besides the webinars, we also have 2.5-hour courses combining to be 5 hours. So all accredited. So do check it out as well. But hopefully you can join us on, to address some of these issues and the 3 evenings at the end of March.
If I could add to that, Sanil.
Sure.
Thank you again for trying to meet, there are those gaps in both in training and education. And it goes back to, again, the bit which I had earlier mentioned, that it's in the public health system where we provide training. Now, if the public health system is not delivering that care, then our trainees are not getting that experience. And I think Victoria used to be well ahead of other states 10 years ago, both in terms of education, research, the academic component, and over the years we have lost it. And I think it's really important to build that capacity, not just in terms of delivery of care, but also research and academics, which have to go along with that. And we all have heard of the Collaborative Center, which is being set up. Again, another sort of ambitious project. But when you talk to other states and the public health system, I think the way, and this used to be again in Victoria 10 years ago and is not really there now, where the academics and research happens at the coalface. So the work, the clinical work, the research, the academics are all tied together at the clinical level, at the health system level, which we seem to be missing. And I think that is something which we do, everybody would benefit from developing that part of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very mindful of time as well. And thank you, Diane, for that question. So I guess, coming back to us psychiatrists, I guess, putting everything that you've said. So the big questions really are, will this be a success this time around? Obviously lots of visionary talk, which is great, reform talk, and I mean that from media, politics, etc. Lots of money, huge amounts of investment, as you mentioned, a once in a lifetime opportunity, and of course, besides the money, the question for us psychiatrists is, what role should we be playing, and how does the Commission see us as psychiatrists, and where do we fit in, in that overall landscape? If you could expand on that. Okay.
It does. So I recently read an article. I mean, that's $1 million question, right? Like, would it be successful this time around? And I think along with the hope also comes the risk of that cynicism of reform being seen with cynicism and limited hope of bringing around that much needed change. And there's a recent article, and I would encourage everybody to read. It is a little cynical. It's by Jennifer Doggett in the Inside Story, where she actually is talking about the Productivity Commission and whether the Productivity Commission would have any chances of breaking the patterns of those cycles of reform. So I won't go through that cycle, but essentially it does talk about various parts of a cycle where we all recognize there's a need to do something about mental health. It all looks very chaotic, very conflictive. So we set up an inquiry. That inquiry takes up a considerable time, energy, resources to bring up the same findings of previous reports, that mental health system is not working, the problems are deep, they're systemic. Then the report sort of recommends a level of spending, but very soon it starts looking hard. It starts looking like this money will not be enough. And soon the stakeholders start competing with whatever is left, or what they perceive to be a dwindling new funding. And very soon it becomes nasty. And then, there's also a body which gets set up. So there's some distance between the minister and the sector. A lot of money is thrown at whosoever the stakeholder is the loudest. And by this time, it starts slowing down. And then it becomes like a bit of a political road to nowhere. People give up on that idea. People sort of start giving it, the whole mental health discussion, a bit of a low profile. And sometimes later, a few years later, a new minister arrives and they say, oh, it's not working, and they set up a new inquiry, and so the cycle continues. So that's a bit of a cynical view. But I think the question is there a mismatch between expectations and ambition of a reform to its implementation work and the impact of that work? And how do we overcome that is a really important question. But I suppose it is important to remember that despite so many years of reform, despite consistent professional, public, political concerns, the deficiencies in the mental health systems, they remain. Despite shared concerns, shared commitment, it's hard to see that progress. I would quote Professor Pat McGorry here, because he has highlighted in one of his recent articles that there are two storm fronts of crises in mental health care. The first is initial access, and the second is quality care for persistent and complex conditions. We all work within mental health systems which are constantly under strain. They're poorly adapted to confront the extent of the community's suffering. And then we have to find new and better treatments. And I think just going back to a few years, Professor Richard Newton, in his paper, Targeting Zero Implications for Public Psychiatric Services, he says, we have to support people with psychiatric illnesses receiving optimal treatment from psychiatric services in a framework which maximizes choice, autonomy, and hope. We have to aim to provide for each person seeking care a suite of packages of approaches which are steeped in best practice. Like, they have to have a choice. They have to have an availability of best practice, evidence-based treatments. And I think we psychiatrists have a clear responsibility of not just providing the best treatment and care possible, but also be strong advocates for the resources to provide the treatment, the services people need, especially when they're struggling with mental illnesses. Not an easy one, but there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a tough gig, and I guess with regards to psychiatrists, could you, since we're coming towards the end of it, are you able to provide us with some insights as to how you see us, where we fit on that landscape, and what role should we be playing? What are the changes that we can make to somehow, make a difference to people, or even at a systemic level?
Yeah, I think I'll just keep it short, mainly because I think we as psychiatrists, and not just psychiatrists, but psychiatrists and trainees and SIMGs, we have to raise our hands. We have to participate in this work whenever an opportunity arises, be it at the system level work, the work, so apart from the clinical work, the systems we work in, joining in the work at the college, RANZCP, which is the peak body which represents us. And yes, it is largely pro bono work, but it needs to be done, and it can be hugely satisfying. So I will put in a plug here for psychiatrists and trainees to join and participate wherever we can, because it is a good opportunity. It is important that we participate in that. Sorry, we didn't have the time to touch on the Medicare bit. But
yeah, sure. No, I think we still have about 3 minutes. So yes, do, because I think the third part was the Medicare aspect. And yeah, if you could sort of summarize your thoughts with regards to Medicare before we sort of wrap it up in some final words. Yeah, do let us know. And I think one really important thing from my perspective, or from many discussions that we have, is we look at funding, and obviously we know NDIS funding, quite huge amounts, and we often look at that and wonder whether that is providing optimal outcomes for patients. Because you did talk about psychosocial interventions, and the question is, is the money being spent appropriately? So if you can cover both Medicare and NDIS briefly.
Okay. Appropriately, I don't know, but we can get to it. But I think it's very important to remember, is it adequate? So some quick numbers. Mental health receives over 7% of the total health budget in Australia, but it accounts for over 12% of the burden of disease. So mental health stays a big under-invested area. So even if the total expenditure on mental health services in Australia has doubled, I think in 10 years, it still works out to be just above $3,000 per person for those getting federal or state funded mental health care. So just around $3,000 per person who gets that care. So not population wide, per person. Now, there has been a recent study done by Dr. Ian Hickey and Sebastian Rosenberg, which shows that actual expenditure in mental health services has been much less than what has been needed. So comparing it to NDIS, and it's just little bit of a wobbly ground, but I will go there. We currently spend around $11 billion a year in Australia to cover 5 million Australians with mental ill health. In comparison, we spend $30 billion a year through NDIS on 500,000 Australians with disability. So for 5 million people with ill health, mental ill health, we spend $11 billion, but for 500,000 people with disability, we spend $30 billion. An average payment, I think, is around $60,000 for someone who has had a psychosocial disability. And I think it's important to remember that annual mental health spending is 20 times greater for those in the NDIS packages than not people who are not in NDIS. That brings us to the question, how many Australians struggling with severe mental illnesses can rely on NDIS? And as Sebastian Rosenberg, he sort of says, is NDIS becoming another disconnected piece to Australia's already fragmented, and I think I would add chaotic, response to mental illness? And just very quickly, I think another question we do need to ask ourselves is destigmatizing mental health and well-being care the same as destigmatizing mental illnesses? There are some commonalities there for sure, but they are somewhat different. And does destigmatizing mental health by not treating it as an illness, but more, and I think treating, I do mean the holistic care with biopsychosocial and cultural aspects of care, by not considering it a health issue and a health system responsibility, are we actually risking making it care, making it worse? So I think care for one struggling with severe mental illnesses, they are the most vulnerable cohort in our communities, and that has to be the priority.
Thank you so much for that. You're definitely very, very punctual and bang on time. Any questions before we sort of wrap it up? Of course, this is recorded, and we will put up the talk on our website as well. So we will definitely let you know. Do let your colleagues know as well once we do put that up. But if there aren't any questions, any final comments from you, Astha?
Just join in, just participate, and just within Victoria, Royal Commission, it does throw up quite a few opportunities for psychiatrists to participate. And I know they're not well funded and well remunerated, and most of them are pro bono, but do join, that's all, and join the college. Yeah, thank you so much for those excellent sort of words and some great wisdom as well. Thank you, Diane, for your question. I hope that all of you, found that useful. And what I'd sort of like to say is that, big thank you to Astha as well. Thank you so much for sharing those aspects and the challenging work as well. So just to wrap it up from our end, I guess, Astha talked about obviously looking at the psychiatrist role. And from our perspective, so Nardine saying very interesting discussion. Thanks, Astha and Sanil. Thank you, Nardine, for joining us as well.
So I guess one of the things that, what we're trying to do through the Academy at PsychScene is set up is tap into this collective wisdom, exactly this. So, look out for a range of webinar series. We've got, just like Astha, a number of other speakers, but importantly, I'd like to, shout out to all of you as well, that if you have that wisdom, that collective wisdom to share, please get in touch, because this is exactly the sort of thing that we want to spread. And it won't be pro bono. So that will be one point of difference. Although, we try to manage things quite well. So Ayla, yeah, thank you. So look out for, the range of webinars coming, the range of interviews coming, and of course the interactive online courses as well. But do join in as well. Get in touch with me if you've got any sort of aspects to share with the wider community. We'd love to hear from you, and I'm sure others would as well.
So the last word, Sanil. So I do want.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Please do.
Congratulations for setting up the new academy, and thank you for all the work you've done over the years, and the ambition you have for the future. So good luck.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much, and thank you all of you for joining in as well and giving up your hour in the evening. With that, thanks, Astha. Thank you, everyone. Good night, and I'll see you soon in another webinar series. Thank you, Astha. Take care. Bye-bye. Synthesizing complex material in psychiatry to simplify your practice.